Hi, thanks for having me. I'm sorry I can't be here in person, but I hope you'll get some great insights as a result of my presentation. I'm going to be talking to you about dealing with online harassment and cyber abuse, sharing some experiences from around the world. I've been looking at this issue since about 2013, and there's a long way to go when it comes to news organisations dealing with the problem, as well as individuals and states. So, what about dealing with online abuse and harassment? How do we start? Well, the first thing we need to do is to define what online harassment is and what hate speech is, because often the two are conflated. So, hate speech is incitement to violence. So, speech that encourages other people to commit acts of violence against others or threats of violence against others. It can be abuse that targets gender, race, sexual orientation. It's harassment that's designed to chill freedom of speech and press freedom. It's also, as I said, threats of physical violence and sexual violence, for example. But it's important to note what it's not. It's really vital that journalists and news organisations are engaged in public spaces where our audiences are, to interact, to inform our journalism. So we need to acknowledge that hate speech, that online harassment, doesn't look like intense criticism of your journalism if that criticism, that critique is justified, if that critique is fair and reasonable. Even if it's robust, it doesn't equate to harassment. Many journalists around the world will say, oh, I'm sick of the trolls, I'm being abused all the time, because they're getting critiqued on the basis of their work, that their work is flawed in some way. Now, that might be unsettling, but it doesn't necessarily equate to online harassment. One of the things I think we have to remember is that when we're dealing with these issues, we're trying to balance the need for regulation and combating cyber abuse and online harassment against freedom of expression rights. And those freedom of expression rights are rights that we share. They're fundamental to our practice of journalism. And I just want to remind you about apartheid-era South Africa as a slight warning. In that context, hate speech began to be understood in law as speech that was negative against the government, the regime of the day. And we don't want a situation where states are able to claim that individuals, including journalists, for example, are committing hate speech or online harassment against leaders when in fact they are doing accountability reporting. So what does online harassment or cyber abuse look like? It's often gendered, it's often sexualised. It targets minorities, people of colour, people of alternative religions, disproportionately. And it includes the work of individuals, people who are being abusive at a one-on-one level. It also includes troll armies, if you like, people who collaborate in acts of abuse. What are called sock puppet networks, so agents of an organisation or a state or an individual who are collectively taking action. And it's increasingly associated with the phenomenon of fake news. So the disinformation and misinformation era that we're part of is increasingly associated with online harassment and cyber abuse, particularly targeting journalists with the objective of chilling the freedom of expression that journalists practice to try and get them to pull back from critique and investigative reporting, for example. So how does it manifest? Well, as many of the journalists in this room will probably testify, it can involve images that are designed to confront, images of decapitated bodies, images of women being raped. These are some of the things that I've seen. Images of an individual journalist that have been altered, turned into memes that defame an individual journalist. They are designed to induce fear and to cause retreat, as I mentioned. They're often intimate in both detail and delivery, and by detail I mean they're intimate in terms of the kinds of abuse that you experience. It could be an attack on your physical appearance, it could be an attack on your family members, an attack on your child, a threat against your child that comes at you. It could be an attack on your sexual orientation, an attack on your religious beliefs, but it's delivered in an intimate way too, because most of us are attached almost permanently to mobile devices. In my case, I'm often wearing it, down my top or in my pocket. It doesn't get more intimate than that in terms of where you're receiving alerts that contain sometimes threatening, sometimes harassing messages. And I've got a quote that you can see behind me and on the screen in front of you from Alexandra Pascalidou, who's a Swedish journalist of Greek descent, who has suffered some really horrific online harassment and threats over her 20-plus career as a journalist. She talks about the feeling of being under attack, a constant warfare, she describes it as, because of the way these messages were bombarding her and reaching her first thing in the morning, last thing at night. Digital security and privacy threats are also features of this phenomenon. So problems like doxing and spoofing. Doxing, if you're unaware, is when journalists or individuals, often human rights defenders, find themselves as victims of this as well, where they are being misrepresented, where their identities are being essentially appropriated, and in that context, they are being exposed with their address, their telephone numbers, other details about them that are identifying. Spoofing is more about the appropriation of a journalist's identity and a misuse of that identity. So sending emails in the name of a journalist, for example, to another party designed to masquerade as that journalist. The problem with these acts is that they are designed to reduce the credibility of the journalist ultimately, because what they do is cause questions to be raised about the authenticity and the reliability of the journalists. Phishing, so that many of you will be familiar with malware and phishing, which are cyber attacks designed to access your data. So the sorts of digital threats that we're facing in the context of investigative journalism, when we're dealing with sources, which we're increasingly aware of, are also the kinds of assaults that are being perpetrated against journalists and others doing acts of journalism, if you like, currently. So these attacks, they can be organic, they can be organised, sometimes they feature the phenomenon of computational propaganda, they can be state-sponsored, they can be a range of things, and it's important to understand how all of these threats that we're experiencing in the context of our daily work as journalists and in newsrooms are starting to converge to produce almost a perfect storm, if you like, of challenges and threats that we have to try and deal with. So some of the global trends that I've observed over the past few years include the closing of comments on websites, proprietary websites, news organisations, mastheads, and a shift of those comments to social platforms. One of the reasons that this is happening is because of so much hate and offensive material being spewed into the comment sections of websites, and it's being perceived as easier to manage if we're outsourcing the comments to the social platforms. Of course, the problem with the social platforms is that there are also spaces where trolling, where really gross and graphic harassment occur, and it's much harder to regulate off your own site if you're relying on third-party intermediaries like Facebook and Twitter, for example. One of the consequences of this is that journalists and citizens, our audiences, our sources, the people we interact with, are withdrawing from interactive fora. So forums where we might want to have debates about major issues, major political issues, major social issues, issues that go to the heart of our democratic function. They're pulling back, so that chilling effect is working. We know also that from research that many journalists, many women journalists in particular, are leaving their work as reporters, and young journalists, fresh graduates, are deciding not to take up a career in journalism because of concern about being daily assaulted and confronted in this way. As I said, women tend to be mostly targeted as a result of the conflation of gender and harassment and hate speech. We're in a situation where women, young women in particular, women of colour, women who are perhaps Muslim, so if you are a young black Muslim woman in the Australian context where I come from, you are much more likely to be targeted than anyone else for harassment. So we have a crisis of gendered online harassment, bearing in mind the implications for other minorities as well. I mentioned that comment sections are being shut down. There was a global study done in 2016 that examined the causes and consequences of the shift of online comments to social media platforms. One of the findings was that in the vast majority of cases, the reason for closing comments was because of the onslaught of harassment and abuse that was being experienced by other users in the comments threads, that was being targeted at journalists, and also the risk of legal action that was becoming greater with every hateful comment, with every racist comment, defamation in some contexts, libel, contempt of court, all sorts of legal issues that come up in different jurisdictions. So shunting those comments into third-party platforms. So why is this so much of a problem? Well, online harassment is not just a case of being called names on the internet. There are genuine psychological consequences from an onslaught of assault, verbal assault, from pictures being thrust at you, from threats being made against your families, as a result of psychological warfare, if you like. Journalists have started to be diagnosed with psychological conditions, and insurance claims are being made within news organisations that result in action being taken to try to address the cause and the consequences of this problem. We also have to face the reality that when threats are made online, they don't necessarily stay online. They can be exhibited and actioned offline. So if somebody is being stalked online, there's a chance that through doxing, for example, through private information being sent public, a journalist becomes much more vulnerable. I mentioned already that women journalists and students are eschewing the profession because of this constant threat. And the other thing to note is that when women withdraw from civil society debate, then you're in a situation where you are really experiencing a skewed public discussion, a public discussion that is devoid of important female voices, ultimately, if women continue to experience these levels of harassment. Also, the privacy and data of journalists, already mentioned this, it's a really huge problem, and it goes not to just our own existence, our own families, it also relates to our ability to get our sources to trust us. If we want to be able to do independent investigative reporting based on confidential source relationships, and our credibility is being constantly undermined online, if also we are in a situation where it appears that we can't protect our own private information, how are we going to be able to protect the private information of our sources? So the problem is also about how very difficult it is to manage the onslaught of comments coming from so many different people, computer-generated comments, state-sponsored comments. How do we actually manage this across so many platforms? We're talking about millions of comments and responses and coming in video form, in pictorial form, in meme form, day after day after day. It's extremely difficult for a news organisation to police. It takes our focus off our daily work. So we understand that we need to be engaged journalists and newsrooms engaged with communities, having community-informed content. But if all we're doing is hitting delete and mute and report on hundreds and sometimes thousands of posts on a daily basis, how are we to actually do our work? This is why this is such an important issue and needs to be addressed. So here are some case studies from around the world that I just want to talk you through. On the top left-hand corner, I'm not sure if you're seeing left or right here, but we can see Ferial Haffajee, who's a very prominent, very experienced South African editor who has been perpetually defamed. She's called a prostitute, which is a hashtag, a term that's being used to describe women in various jurisdictions, women journalists, to imply that, that they are prostitutes, essentially, who are from the press. Ferial has experienced an onslaught as a result of Gupta leaks, which is a national scandal in South Africa involving economic corruption, political corruption, and the targeting of women journalists in the context of reporting on this issue has been very familiar because it's a pattern that's experienced around the world. Ferial has written for Huffington Post about her own experiences and the impact that it had on her. Jessica Valenti is tweeting there. She's a US Guardian feminist writer. She's tweeting about threats she had experienced herself, but when they came for her 5-year-old daughter, when they threatened her, she decided to withdraw from social media for a period of time, which is, again, a consequence of experiencing this constant series of threats. On the other side, the word slut is written across the face of Alexandra Pascalidou, who I referenced earlier, a Swedish journalist. She's actually produced a great interactive video which summarises some of her experiences. She reads from tweets, she reads from even analogue letters that have come in response to campaigns that have started online. And she is taking her fight to the European Union. She's given evidence before a European Commission of Inquiry into experience of women journalists in curtailment of press freedom around the world. We also have Zoe Quinn in the middle there from Gamergate fame. 2013 she experienced extraordinary online harassment as a writer and a game designer who was daring to question the misogyny within the gaming community. Journalists who then wrote about her story found themselves hounded, so much so that some of them fled their homes. They were so afraid for their safety and that of their families. The FBI investigated. This is when society really started to take notice of what was happening. Up above is a Finnish journalist from the national Finnish broadcaster. She's based in Helsinki. She dared to try to investigate Russian trolling farms and the onslaught of state-sponsored trolling of journalists. And when she used social media, as we do, to try and crowdsource lived experiences of being targeted or witnessing such trolling, she became a victim. And she has been experiencing this for 3 going on 4 years. She's written about her experiences, and she's done that as a way of trying to raise awareness. She's also sought intervention from the authorities, and this becomes a theme. We now start to hear stories of legal action being taken against individuals who make threats. Depending on the jurisdiction, that can be effective. There are many states around the world where there is no such faith in the police, or there's no such capacity in a police service to do that kind of crime watching and law enforcement. But nevertheless, it's becoming a significant problem. And then we have Maria Ressa, your own Maria Ressa, who has done the most exemplary work, in my view, globally in terms of shining a light on this massive problem, highlighting the causes and the consequences of state-sponsored harassment and ensuring that there's not going to be a silencing effect on the work of Rappler, which is ultimately the aim of all of these actors. And I won't go into detail about Maria's story. I've written about it for a UN publication. Other people have heard her speak about it. But she is somebody in your midst who you can actually take cues from in terms of managing these problems. And I'll summarise some of the points I learned from her and others in terms of defensive mechanisms. So it's important to think about the context of experiences from a research perspective as well. This is not just randomly accumulated experiences of women journalists and journalists more broadly. We've had now a range of studies internationally that we can draw on to draw conclusions about the problem and how widespread it is. So in 2014, a very large analysis of tweets was undertaken by Demos, a UK-based research organisation, and they found that women journalists and TV news presenters received 3 times as much abuse as their male counterparts, demonstrating that this is very much an experience of women that is much more severe and extreme than the experience of most men in the context of online harassment. So almost 3/4 of women online have been exposed to some sort of cyber violence. That's according to the United Nations Broadband Commission from 2015. OSCE did a really significant study in 2015, which was published early in 2016, about female bloggers and other media actors, journalists who were experiencing online threats. And they found that, again, it was disproportionately being experienced by them in reference to their journalism. So they were being targeted because of their journalism. They were also being targeted because they were women speaking, often women speaking in societies where male power had not been disrupted, or was, in the case of some of those states, in the process of being disrupted. Here's another case study that some of you might be familiar with from the UK. Caroline Criado Perez is a journalist, a feminist, who started a campaign to get women on banknotes in the UK, and she wanted to see Jane Austen, novelist, on one of the banknotes. She received in 2013 the most extraordinary threats. Some of these words that have to be heard to be believed. So I'm going to speak this to you. There were threats to mutilate my genitals, threats to slit my throat, threats to bomb my house, to pistol whip me, threats to burn me alive. I was told I'd have poles shoved up my vagina, dicks shoved down my throat. I was told I'd be begging to die as a man would ejaculate in my eyes. And then they started posting my address and linked that around the internet. I felt hunted. I felt terrified. Examples like this we see over and over again globally, not just limited to societies where journalists have the time and capacity to focus on these issues. This is an absolutely global phenomenon. Some other examples. I was raped in the imaginations of many men, and in so many different ways that they expressed their interest in doing that to me in person, and they promised to do the same to my mother. Jenna Price, who's a colleague of mine from Australia who writes for Fairfax Media, said once a week some thug would suggest that what had fixed my feminist mindset was a good raping. You can see how familiar the terms rape and sexual assault, the experiences of sexualised violence, are in the context of this. But it's important to remember that it's not just women who are the victims of online harassment and abuse. This is a case study again from Australia. An investigative reporter from Melbourne called Nino Bucci, who has done significant work reporting on organised crime in that city. He works for Fairfax Media. He faced a situation where his image was appropriated, where a website was set up in his name, calling him a misogynist, ironically, designed to attract criticism and harassment because of alleged sexism on his part. So this website was up for months and months and months. Efforts to get it removed were not successful. So that's Nino. There are many other cases involving men as well. The difference being that often they do not have the same level of threats of sexualised violence attached to them. So what can we do about it? Well, we always hear that we should ignore it, mute it, block it, delete it, report it. I don't know how many of you have tried to go through a process of getting Facebook or Twitter or any of the other platforms to address threats that you've received. I've noticed recently that when I report, as I do on a daily basis, offensive tweets, abusive tweets, harassing tweets, that instead of the issues being referred up, they're frequently coming back with a statement that they haven't found any evidence of inappropriate speech in this context. Of course, there are daily struggles with Facebook as well, and Facebook is a massive platform on which many organisations depend for distribution of their content. We cannot not be there as news publishers and journalists, but getting Facebook to take action to recognise the role that journalists play, particularly in democracies, the role that freedom of expression and press freedom in particular play in terms of allowing those states and governments and corporations to be held accountable, are not attributes that Facebook has readily and quickly understood. And so there's much criticism around the failure of Facebook to act swiftly. And it's not just Facebook, it's not just Twitter, it's a range of other platforms as well as they arise. Reverse trolling, counter-trolling, which is the idea of, for example, capturing and sharing attacks and assaults on a journalist, and redistributing them to an audience with a view to getting the audience to then take down the troll. That has some effect. It's also pretty risky, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Do you call the cops or hire a lawyer? Well, in my country, where in New South Wales, Sydney's the capital of New South Wales, there has recently been a case where it was recognised that online harassment in the form of constant threats of physical and sexual assault was deemed to be actionable, and a man was charged and will serve a jail term. But that's rare. We see experiences of that happening also in some of the Nordic countries and other parts of Europe, but it's not something that we are seeing globally, and there are questions around how enforceable it is. So this problem is large, and it's also difficult to solve at the level of states, at the level of corporations, at the level of individual actors, newsrooms, and so on. What can the victims that I've consulted and researched over the past few years share with us? One of the things that has come up from many of the journalists that I've worked with and from studies that I've reviewed is that it's necessary to withdraw from duty sometimes. A lot of news organisations will ignore the threats, will ignore the complaints of journalists, and tell the journalists themselves that they need to toughen up, they need to get a thicker skin, they need to do the old mute and delete. But sometimes it's necessary to actually take a full step back, to disconnect from the internet altogether for a period of time. And that's because you need recovery time. You need to actually be able to do your work undisrupted. But that's not a permanent solution. It's only a solution for 24 or 48 hours, potentially, if you're going to stay working as a journalist. Yes, you can go through the mute process, but again, that's extremely time-consuming, and if you're talking about reporting to those platforms, it's not necessarily successful. The counter-trolling, the reverse trolling. So some women have talked about finding power in getting their communities to defend them by counter-trolling the attackers that they've had, throwing insults at them. And one example was, to retweet an offensive tweet with a comment like, oh, this poor guy, he has to write this in order to feel brave. The problem is that this can be a red flag, a trigger for a pile-on, a mass kind of onslaught of other attacks. So be really cautious about whether or not you are going to reverse troll. Think carefully about whether you have the resources and capacity to deal with that. Okay, so what do we do about it in our own midst? So I've come up with 14 or 15 points to combat cyber abuse and online harassment in newsrooms. So the first and most important thing is to acknowledge the problem and take the impact seriously. That goes for individuals, to call it out, to acknowledge that you're experiencing something that's extremely negative, and to ensure that you take it to your employer if you are in a news organisation as opposed to working independently as a freelancer, which adds another layer of complexity. You need to make sure that senior management are aware of the issues. You need to recognise the psychological impacts are in and of themselves very real. You need to ask for, or in the case of management, facilitate psychological support. You also need to provide cybersecurity and digital safety training and integrate that digital safety training into the physical safety training. In many newsrooms around the world, journalists will undergo 24, 48-hour, 3-day courses in defensive strategies for reporting in war zones, for example, or in times of disaster. But digital safety training is still very much an afterthought. It's something that's being tacked on. It needs to be integrated. It's a really important point. Women journalists need specific training to help them deal with cyber misogyny because of the very intimate and sexualised nature of many of these assaults. We need to see news organisations investing in community engagement management. That includes clear policies and guidelines, and also in effective reporting tools within their organisations. So make it easy for your journalists, for your staff, to identify where there's a problem and to report it, particularly in larger news organisations where this sort of stuff can just get lost in the daily thrust. When it comes to comment moderation on your own websites, consider adding misogynistic terms to the guidelines. So words that kept coming up in all of these studies, words like slut and whore and bitch, for example. Think about whether it's possible to put those words in as alert words, or words that will be filtered out. Ask your audiences to help repel and contain attacks. This is something that Maria Ressa and Rappler have talked about doing to harness the good communities that they've built around their content, to deflect and to police the kind of hate speech that's being experienced online. Make a plan to deal with potential harassment at the commissioning stage of a story. Be aware that there's a subset of stories that are known to be more likely triggers for online harassment and abuse. They include stories about feminism. They include stories about racist politics. So in the case of European newsrooms, stories around migration, for example. Stories that are designed to counter any kind of discrimination tend to be lightning rods for trolls. Stories that perhaps go to the heart of disrupting male power. So not just stories about feminism, but stories that, like the example of Gamergate, where there is, incredibly misogynistic temperament within that community. It was obviously a set of stories that we can see now were going to trigger this kind of response. If you have young journalists sitting on a social desk, for example, and often they're the most inexperienced in mainstream newsrooms, the least experienced, they're sitting there and they're receiving the assaults, the attacks coming fast and furiously at them. And there is often a need to provide counselling after an experience of dealing with a story that is a lightning rod story. So if you prepare them in advance, you're going to have an easier time of managing the problem. You need to escalate early, so don't wait for a threat to cross over from the internet to your physical realm. Don't wait until that stalker has found where you park your car or where you live. Make sure that you're escalating in a timely manner. And explore the technical solutions. There's an example here, Trollbusters, which is a US initiative run by a woman called Michelle Ferrier, who has recently received funding from the International Women's Media Foundation, and she's going to be doing some additional research and creating, hopefully, some technical solutions to go with that that will make it easier for women to connect with one another, share their experiences, and ensure that society is better prepared to advocate for women's rights online. There's also the Coral Project, which is a project out of the US involving the New York Times, the Washington Post, Mozilla and the Knight Foundation. And they are working on using artificial intelligence and a range of other technologies to try to better identify, more easily identify, in the case of comments on websites, whether a post is likely to be offensive, whether a post is likely to require moderation, for example. The other thing that's important is to request or provide, in the case of management, fast technical and legal support. Legal support in the jurisdictions where there's a possibility of legal action, but we're in the process now of having to try and educate in-house lawyers, police officers, the judiciary. These are such new issues and they're coming thick and fast. Be activists yourselves as journalists. This is a major press freedom issue. It's not a time to be quiet. It's not a time to sit back and hope it all passes. It is not going to pass. It is going to get worse. So we have to be calling for action and doing so really vocally. Call the platforms to account and call out their failure to adequately manage the problem, their failure to curtail the problem. Forge alliances with one another across news organisations, across borders. This is an international problem. It needs an international response. So I hope you've heard something here that's valuable, something that you can take back to your newsrooms or your desk if you're working as a freelancer. I hope that you can leverage the online communities of support that you have built as well to assist you in dealing with this problem. Think about what works for you, what doesn't work. Take the time out to do some threat modelling around your own stories or within your own newsroom. Think about what needs to change and how you're going to go about doing that. And then let's think about how we can work together, again, across boundaries, across the boundaries of news organisations, across national boundaries, across language barriers. This is something that is happening and is being documented from places around the world like Hungary, Norway, the Philippines. We are seeing case study after case study, and it's important to bring them all together and to learn from them and to take some action. Thanks very much.